All right. So how is everyone today? You're all happy? Good. Good. Stuff here. Where are we? So I decided to throw in some stuff that'll lead us somewhat afield or far ahead of where we might prefer to study this material, but I figured, what the heck, but at the very least I want to get deeper into Norton's perspective on natural resource management. He does have a very important and valuable, practically valuable contribution to make, and that might be illuminated somewhat by looking at his background and where he comes from and kind of what he's all about. Nowadays, he comes from this generation of many of the authors that we're going to read throughout the term come from roughly the same generation, World War II baby boomers, most of them born between 1940 and 1955 or so. And they all know each other pretty much, most of them know each other. We read the classics too. Obviously, these guys didn't know Uncle Aldo, or they didn't know Albert Schweitzer, but of course they studied them. And but they all go to the same conferences roughly. And this little community of it's a global community. It's kind of dominated perhaps by North American environmental ethicists, but the Australians have made some very important contributions. This we'll get into a little bit today when I mention the work of Richard Sylvan, who in those days called himself Richard Rutley, who wrote a famous essay in which he laid out this famous thought experiment regarding he called it the last man thought experiment, but we updated it a little bit. Call it the last human experiment. We'll get into that a little bit. So anyway, the Australians have made some contributions, some Canadians, of course, a few Western Europeans. We kind of stay away from the Western European environmental ethicists because most of them are drawing on a whole different tradition, continental philosophy tradition, which we're drawing on, but more deeply through Kant. And these other guys are, anyway, it's a very rich field. And the Europeans kind of came on board late, so you can imagine, because we're way ahead of them in terms of our relationship with natural resources, right? We're just way ahead of those guys. So. But the Australians are kind of on pace with us, kind of a similar history with the magnificent landscape that they grew to love as they became more at home over several generations, and as the continent became less and less of just a place to exploit and extract resources. So anyway, a really amazing history of environmentalism in North America. And this all came together in the early to mid-1970s in the academy, right, which is where we are. We're in a Western secular liberal arts university, right? And in a secular Western liberal arts university, nobody talked about environmental ethics. There were no environmental ethics. There were no environmental philosophy courses on anybody's curriculum in any North American university until the mid-1970s. And there's some controversy. I don't know the details exactly, but I believe Holmes Ralston takes credit for teaching the first environmental philosophy class at the University of Colorado State University in, I always forget where that is. Anyway, that's where he spent his whole career pretty much. Now he's in emeritus. He was born in 1930, and he's kind of the elder spokesperson, the dean of North American environmental ethics. And we don't get to him until much later because he's actually a very sophisticated thinker, metaethically speaking. And we need to, get our metaphysical chops, a little more up to speed before we tackle Holmes Ralston. So he's born in 1930. He's still alive, still active. Doesn't teach very much anymore. Obviously, he's in his mid-80s now. And then Baird Collicott takes credit for teaching the first environmental ethics class at the University of Wisconsin's Stevens Point, which has an intimate all of Wisconsin has an intimate history with Aldo Leopold, of course, which is where he spent his work, which is where he spent his most influential and most transformative years as a scholar and a scientist and an amateur ethicist. So anyway, that's kind of, so these guys, they're all born around that same time period, roughly 1935 and 1955, let's say, except for Ralston, he's a little bit older. Ralston has a very interesting history too. He came from a science background, but also a theology background. Anyway, very, very accomplished scholar, and very prolific writer, but that's a ways away. So today I'll be happy if we just go a little deeper into the work of Brian Norton, who is one of these guys that they all kind of attend the same conferences and they know each other, and he's articulated his own unique point of view in environmental ethics, and he comes out of a classical American philosophy tradition, which otherwise is referred to as the tradition of pragmatism. American pragmatism is our great contribution to the world of Western philosophy. Classical American pragmatism is at its peak between, say, 1880 and 1920 or so. John Dewey is his most popular exponent of that school of philosophy, and he lived all the way up until 1952 and kept writing prolifically through the 30s and 40s. So, it was going strong in those days, and he had a tremendous influence on the philosophy of education, which pragmatists are very, very keen on philosophy of education. But William James is my philosophical hero, if I have one, and he's another one of these classical American philosophers, another one of these pragmatists who lived from 1842 to 1910, and probably the most important, the best writer among the group. Anyway, hopefully maybe some of you get a chance to take a class on pragmatism. It's really kind of a cool school of philosophy, and it's the one that I identify with mostly. Although I try not to pin myself down too much, especially in such a still young field such as environmental ethics. I hesitate to make a commitment to one school or another. I have admiration for a lot of them, and find some of them are stronger and weaker in various places. But anyway, so we'll try to go a little deeper into. But see, the thing about Brian Norton too, and environmental pragmatism is itself a very diverse school. If we were to spend a week or so on environmental pragmatism, we'd read Brian Norton, we'd read Anthony Weston. Maybe we'd read a couple other guys too. And they're all very diverse. So, but Norton is very, very interested and involved in policy formation, in policy analysis. And he spent most of his career not in the academy, not as a professor. I'm pretty sure he does have a PhD in philosophy. I don't even know that for sure, though. But he's taught, obviously, and he teaches environmental ethics all the time. He probably teaches in the philosophy. I believe he's in the philosophy department now at the University of maybe Georgia Tech, somewhere in the South. Anyway, but most of his career he was inside the Beltway. He worked in Washington D.C. With either as a legislative staff member for working for a congressperson, or as a federal agency staff member, like BLM or Forest Service, stuff like that. And so he's very interested in bridging the gap between the academy and actual on-the-ground environmental policy. And so he's just convinced, and it's really hard to dispute him on this point, that the philosophical orientation which produces the best effect, which gets the most bang for its buck, is the one that produces the most protection for the things that we really care about, right? And this is a hallmark of pragmatist thinking. Practical experience is the ultimate test of the rightness or wrongness of any action, including the truth or falseness of any action, okay? Or the truth or falseness of any proposition. It always comes up, the proof is in the tasting of the pudding, right? And that's it for a pragmatist. But that doesn't mean you can't just make up your own nonsense and live by it, right? Because that's going to be inconsistent with the world you encounter. So it's not like anything goes, all right? It's not like, well, I'm going to do the most expedient thing, right? And if it tells me to steal, no, it's not like that at all, right? It's not just anything goes pragmatic. It's not that kind of pragmatism. It's not pragmatism in a vulgar sense. Whenever we talk about pragmatism in a philosophy class, we know we're talking about a whole theoretical approach to epistemology, to ethics, the study of knowledge, the study of morality, the study of aesthetics, right? These guys have something to say about, and metaphysics, of course. They have a lot to say about metaphysics, and a very, actually, kind of an ambiguous relationship with metaphysics. William James, in particular, often in many of his writings seems to suggest that he's put an end. He doesn't want to do it anymore. We don't need to do it anymore, right? But then in other parts of his writings, he gets into some really heavy-duty questions about the nature of value. And anyway, so I thought today we would just highlight Norton's position. It turns out that he's happy to call himself a holistic anthropocentrist. Okay? But I think really, to be fair to him, what he means by that is that when it comes to the nitty-gritty of constructing a frame or a lens through which to view a particular management problem, it's just most helpful and most effective to organize that management problem around long-term ecologically sensitive human concerns. Okay, so that's the sense in which he is an anthropocentrist, and he likes to call himself, to separate himself from guys like Baxter or other anthropocentrists, who are just brazenly anthropocentric. You say, that's it, guys. Forget about these penguins and all that. Humans are the only measurement, right? It's the only one that makes any sense at all. So he separates himself from those guys by calling himself a weak, and he's the only guy who uses this terminology, but it is kind of helpful. He calls his point of view a weakly anthropocentric. So his answer to the axiological question, what is the basic unit of moral value in natural resources, his answer to the question is the human community, right? But the whole human community conceived long term, which in his view means we have to take into account future generations too. All right, so that's kind of where he's coming from. And other pragmatists, though, we'll dig a little deeper metaphysically or metaethically and recognize that, hey, when you start being a holist, you're kind of so far at the boundaries, and the boundaries themselves are porous between anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric, because we're all nested, right? Our human community is just inextricably nested in the ecological community. And so if you want to talk about us holistically, you have to talk about our ecological community, the ecosystems that we depend upon, right? So there is a strong sense in which, to be fair to someone like Norton, he's not saying that other beings don't have moral status. He's just saying, he's saying they might. It's hard to explain how that can be. But in the end, practically speaking, we're faced with these moral challenges, and this is the best way to resolve them, by thinking of our long-term human interests, right? And we have all kinds of long-term human interests that we can refer to explain why we want to protect a lot of these things in nature that we want to protect. Like the atmosphere. So I got this slide up here. Might as well. This thin blue line is our atmosphere. They say that if the Earth was shrunk down to the scale of a basketball, then this thin blue line of our atmosphere would be thinner than a layer of cellophane. It gives you kind of an idea of the finitude of our lives, of our resources, of our planet. Right? And what's happened, of course, is that we've clogged our atmosphere with all kinds of things, that without human industrial activity would not be up there. And it's created a thermal blanket over our planet, and it's disrupted our climate systems dramatically. And that's the big story that we always have to keep in mind of our generation, right? That's what's happening. And that's what our guys are telling us. This is what our enlightenment, the flowers of enlightenment, our scientific geniuses are making this very, very, very clear. It's really, I suggest it's easier. Climate science is really much more simple and elemental than evolution. And then I have to acknowledge that there's a substantial portion of the American population that doesn't believe in evolution either. So we're in pretty big trouble, folks, when we got these just insane people. Anyway, enough of that. We just try to be reasonable here. So this is kind of where I left off last class, and this kind of gives you a deep insight into where Norton's coming from with his pragmatic or pragmatist orientation. Because he wants to entertain this question as a live question, all right? And this is kind of his way of wrestling with Leopold's epiphany, too. There's a reason why I like to talk about that wolf that Uncle Aldo shot, or one of his buddies shot. We don't even know who actually shot that wolf. Somebody in his group that he was in charge of, so really he did. But anyway, there are different interpretations of what happened, right? The more charitable kind of Sierra Club, spiritual, beautiful interpretation is that Leopold really did have this spiritual awakening, right? And then he came to realize that it just rocked the foundations of his whole cosmology and metaphysics, right? Watching that happen. And just experiencing it. It wasn't just watching, it was a whole, anyway. That's more the romantic, right? He became an ecocentrist, right? But of course the evidence shows that for another 20 years at least, he continued spearheading this predator eradication program, and Norton brings that out. It's a fair point to make, right? If you're going to start suggesting that Leopold underwent some huge magical transformation, then you have to explain how could he reconcile that, that new awakening, right? That new metaphysical awareness of the moral status of wolves, of ecosystems, of the mountain, thinking like a mountain, right? How could he reconcile that with his work in the predator eradication program in the Forest Service? So it's a live question. Is Earth a mechanism, like scientists suggest, right? There's a reading of the history of Western philosophy and Western relationships with the natural world that you may or may not find plausible, but according to one reading, the scientific revolution was accompanied by a simultaneous, it wasn't just a scientific revolution, it was a whole revolution in our relationship with the natural world. And the natural world became an inert object for humans to study, to learn about, to learn the regular laws that govern nature, and then to control and master, to use that knowledge of the regular laws of nature, the physics and chemistry, to create all this technology. And we've done that, and it's been a remarkably successful, the most remarkably successful kind of epistemological, knowledge-related developments in the history of humankind, probably. It's the scientific revolution. But we might suggest that we paid a huge price because morality became an orphan, right? Perhaps. It's one interpretation. Because Earth, especially morality with regard to the moral dimensions of our relationships with the natural world, right? Perhaps this is misguided, but it has been suggested that before the scientific revolution, we had a more enchanted and enchanting relationship with natural resources, okay? And then the scientific world involved kind of stripping the subjectivity out of everything in nature, right? So nature no longer has any kind of hint of moral status. It's just an object for us to manipulate, to enrich ourselves, and to learn about, to improve our lives, right? To make our lives more efficient. So, but that now ecology is suggesting, and some of the things, some of the philosophy that Leopold was reading in the 30s and 40s, like this guy, P.D. Uspensky, who was a Russian kind of mystic, really. And in those days, he identified his school of philosophy, his school of thought as organicism. And he postulated that the Earth, as a whole, is a living organism. And you've heard this before, right? It came up more recently in the 80s, 70s, and 80s with the Gaia hypothesis, this climate scientist named James Lovelock, who came up with theorized that the planet itself has organismic qualities, right? It is self-organizing, and it regulates its own temperature through the various... Anyway, you've read all this, heard all this, right? Anyway, people were thinking like that way back, and this guy named Uspensky, Leopold happened to be reading him. And so it's possible that part of what went on with Leopold's thinking and the evolution of his thinking from 1909 to 1945, when he's writing a Sand County Almanac, part of what went on, perhaps, is that he was influenced by this Russian organicist, and he began to believe, and he accepted the metaphysical proposition that ecosystems have moral status, right? They can think. Mountains, right? Mountains can think, right? It's a profound possibly it could be, right? But Norton says no. Actually, if you look at Leopold's life and what he did, professionally during that whole time period, he was involved in the predator eradication program, and it wasn't until he got he developed a scientific awareness of the relationship between predators and ecosystem processes, you could say, the whole biotic community. It wasn't until he became scientifically aware of all the connections that are disrupted when predators are removed from the environment that he changed his point of view. So it wasn't a metaphysical transformation at all. He remained, right? And that's why the title of Norton's essay is The Constancy of Leopold's Land Ethic, okay? It was basically the same land ethic as right? It became scientifically, ecologically, biologically much more sophisticated. But it didn't involve any kind of metaphysical transformation. The way somebody like Collicott or if Rolston was to tackle, this wolf episode with Leopold, they might suggest that there's this profound metaphysical transformation. Anyway, so this is how Norton goes about answering this question: is Earth and goes about explaining how Leopold himself wrestled with this question as a land manager, right? So, 3 levels of thinking about the world. First order beliefs. Simply facts, scientific facts disclosed by investigation of the empirical world. Okay? And ecology doesn't begin really until the 1920s, right? It's a very, very new science. It's only 100 years old. And you know, I mean, you might say it began earlier than that, but it didn't really begin to be organized into a discipline until the 1920s. And Leopold had, of course, a lot to do with that organization, and a couple other guys whose names escape me right now, but it's just scientists, ecologists, you know, early ecologists. Then some of the facts they tell us about the world is that all members of the biotic community are interrelated, right? Now, moving on to a higher level, or a more abstract level of thinking about the world. Two propositions. Earth is a mechanistic system, right? And these two propositions, we're going to use these two propositions to try to explain the first order beliefs, the facts that are disclosed by science about the empirical world, okay? One proposition that we could use to explain those facts is that Earth is a mechanistic system, all right? And this proposition is strongly anthropocentric generally. It's strongly anthropocentric. Land, air, water, wildlife have no moral value independent of human use value. Land, air, water, wildlife can and should be manipulated in ever more sophisticated ways, aided by Baconian science in order to extract human benefits from them. All right, and this, of course, is Group A. Group A conservationism in Leopold's A-B cleavage. All right, and when I say Baconian, all right, these little bells should go off in your mind. You should, okay, Enlightenment, heavyweight Enlightenment thinker. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1630 or something. Anyway, he published Novum Organum, this title of his book, his famous book, earth-shattering book, Novum Organum, in 1620, and usually the scientific revolution is dated to the publication of that book, because that's the first book in which and of course it's a philosopher. Philosophers have their fingerprints over every major development in Western culture. And Bacon was a very impressive figure. Very, very, very powerful man. And he, you know, and his influence, of course, is, you know, it's just overshadowed all history since then. And we're still strongly, right, under the influence of Baconian science and Group A conservationism. All right, and economic reductionism, Pinchotian conservationism are the only reasonable systems for determining right natural resource policy. That all follows from the Baconian view, worldview, Baconian, Cartesian, right, referring to René Descartes, Newtonian, referring to whatever his name was, Newton, Isaac, was it Isaac?
Yeah.
Very good. Isaac was in the Bible too. Anyway, okay, so and then along comes this novelty, right, this new exotic theory, Earth is a living organism, and maybe we can explain Leopold by citing this proposition that actually Earth is not a mechanism, it's a living organism, an ecosystem, right, and it has all these subparts, right? All these sub-organisms, the Amazon rainforest, the Pacific Ocean, the salmon ecosystem with the Colombian Snake Rivers, et cetera, right? The temperate rainforests of our region. They're all also living organisms, right? Perhaps with teloi, right? Headed somewhere, goal, aim, purpose, end, design, perhaps. And of course, the more teleologically we tend to interpret natural history, evolutionary history, and the emergence of ecosystems, the more, perhaps, moral status we tend to assign to them. But this could support a strong ecocentric axiological orientation, right? If the Earth is a dead mechanism, if the ecosystem of the rainforest is just a collection of stuff, right, just a mechanism, then there's nothing morally problematic about cutting it down, right? But if the rainforest is an organism, right, then it has something like an interiority. It has something like a telos, a purpose, a design, an aim, and end, like we all do, right? And then we have to think of it as something that has moral status, the way we all have moral status, right? So, and this leads into Group B, but Group B is an ambiguous group, because we know that, you know, I teach you that they're still conservationists, right? So we can't stretch conservationism any farther, right? I'm sorry. It's already stretched out so far. We're just going to draw the limit it's always anthropocentric, right? But there is this moment in Leopold's discussion of Group B conservationists where he really is saying that these guys are ecocentrists, right? So it's like this threshold, right? Once you're among those Group B people, you find some ecocentrists. But they're, at that point, they've kind of broken ranks, right? And they're not really anthropocentrists anymore. Anyway, these guys, these different approaches to these different kinds of traditions in environmental ethics are all reasonable systems under this hypothesis that Earth is a living organism. These all become much more plausible, right? John Muir is not just egocentric, but theocentric too, because he's got this very strongly kind of mystical interpretation of nature, the value of nature. Anyway, so now we're left with the question, all right, we're just resource managers over here. We've got to worry about wolves and forests and stuff like that. We've got to make important decisions, right? So we can't just dwell on these metaphysical questions about what Earth is, right? About whether it has a soul or not. Come on, all right? So let's see what we can do to sort our way through this problem, right, or this conflict that seems to arise. Which way of thinking about the Earth is going to last the longest, okay, is what Norton proposes we use to decide which kind of hypothesis to follow, okay? And this is the third order principle that Norton uses. The third order principle that Norton uses today, we would use this buzzword sustainability, right? That's the third order principle. Which of these conceptions of Earth is more sustainable, culturally and ecologically? All right? All right, so any third order principle is any principle which guides the thinker's evaluation of second order beliefs, okay? Which provide criteria for distinguishing acceptable cultural practices from unacceptable ones, all right? And this is where Norton likes to refer to this guy named Hadley, who I used to champion as, and then I found out he was an economist, oh my God. But he was Yale, president of Yale. He's one of these guys that are like, okay man, Hadley, you know, Norton Hadley's a big pragmatist, right? He's just a big fan of William James, right? Hobnobs around, because William James taught at Yale, right? So anyway, there's a big Yale connection between, obviously, Pinchot and, because the Yale Forestry School was established by Pinchot's family, right, through their endowment. Very wealthy, and they still exist, actually. I mean, they're very strong, they're going strong. Probably the nation's preeminent forestry school to this day. And they have an experimental forest in Pennsylvania, actually, which is owned, it's on the Pinchot family estate. Gray Towers, I think it's called. Anyway, the Pinchots are a very prominent family. I may digress. John Kennedy was a pretty good conservationist, and his last maid squeeze was Mary Pinchot Meyer, who was Gifford Pinchot's niece. Anyway, there are all these connections, and he appears actually at a dedication to this the Pinchot Conservation Institute, something like that. Anyway, that Pinchot's sons created in the 60s, in the early 60s, and Kennedy went and gave the inaugural address, right? It was a big deal. And, but you can see in the background, you can see Mary Pinchot and her sister, too, right back there. Anyway, she was all, there's a lot going on there. But that was right before he got assassinated. So. And then she got murdered, too, about a year after he got assassinated. Anyway, a lot of dark and mysterious things went on. But the Pinchots, anyway, and they still own that estate. And Gray Towers, you know, is, I think, part of the Yale Forestry School. I mean, they use that. They use their land. That's where their experimental forest is. But this Hadley guy, I forget what his first name was. Arthur, maybe it was Arthur. Anyway, Hadley was president of Yale while Leopold attended the Yale Forest School. And Hadley is on record in many of his speeches and writings as being a pragmatist and a follower of William James, you know, an ardent admirer of William James's pragmatism. And so that mere association Norton uses to identify, he draws kind of this big inference, which historically isn't necessarily very supported at all, that Leopold was exposed to pragmatism while he was at Yale because the president of Yale was Arthur Hadley, who was a pragmatist, right? And I didn't know very much about Arthur Hadley, but later on I found out he actually wasn't even a philosophy professor, he was an economics professor. Not only that, but he was a Republican, and he was really pretty damn conservative. I think a strong supporter of U.S. involvement in World War I. Anyway, and James ended up repudiating harshly. So take that with a grain of salt. All this stuff about Hadley and all this stuff about how Leopold was influenced by pragmatism, we don't know. You know, there's an ongoing dispute about that. But there's something about this, you know, that kind of ties together, right? Throw out Hadley and, you know, de-emphasize pragmatism. And you get a pretty good idea of what Leopold was all about in his evolution, right? And what happened in his experience with that wolf, right? It wasn't until many years of practical on-the-ground observation of the effects of predator eradication that Leopold came around, right? To this more, what we might think of as an ecocentric point of view, this idea that the wolf pack itself has biotic rights. Anyway, which is a startling suggestion, right? If the wolf pack has biotic rights, then there's some non-anthropocentric moral status going on, right? There has to be. So that's why Leopold is an enigma, and you know, it's hard to make sense, and that's why we end up having to turn to a subsequent generation of philosophers to try to do this metaethical work, right? Because you know, according to Norton, evidently the wolf pack does not have any actual moral status, but it still behooves us. The land manager is making the morally wrong decision for long-sighted anthropocentric reasons when the land manager eradicates a predator. Okay, right? But the predator itself and the predator's pack doesn't have any actual moral status. Ultimately, what Norton's point of view comes down to. And that may not be enough, right? That's inside the beltway, get it done kind of thinking, right? This is good for our long-term interests. But is it really a comprehensive account of what's going on when it comes to the moral dimension of our, right? Do we protect old-growth forests just because it's in our long-term human interest? A lot of people want to say no, right? It's the right thing to do, you know? It doesn't matter what the hell our long-term human is. Look at it this way. If we could do all these things and not inflict any harm at all on our long-term human interests, according to that point of view, if we could replace all the old-growth rainforests that we love so much with just perfectly formed synthetic materials, totally perfectly reproduced with the smells and the sounds and little drones that perfect, you know, duplicate replicas of spotted owls, right, zooming around. We go out in nature, right? And if that worked, if that was the value of nature, the stuff we got from the experience of nature, and that's it, long term, you know, and that makes us happy, right? Then perhaps it's all good. Perhaps the fracking, the drilling, you know, the clear cutting, we'll just replace it all, man, right? But on the other hand, if they have intrinsic value, then there's something like intrinsic value, something like some kind of non-instrumental value, which many Sierra Club type, many remotely spiritual people recognize that an ancient rainforest, it's just, there's a magnificence there, an orca, right? The dolphins we saw at the start of class. There's a magnificence, there's an autopoiesis, if you will. There's a self-creation to them, to an ecosystem that is inherently worthy of respect, right? And this explanation of why we should practice sustainable natural resource management maybe is just, it leaves you kind of dissatisfied.